Ask almost anyone when Israel began, and most will answer with a date, 1948. They picture flags raised in Tel Aviv, a declaration read aloud, and a new state rising on the map. But that moment, dramatic as it was, is not the beginning. It is only the most recent chapter in a story that stretches back thousands of years. This land once held kingdoms with fortified walls and royal courts. Pilgrims thronged to a temple in Jerusalem. Empires tore it down, and exiles wept by the rivers of Babylon. They returned, rebuilt, and rebelled again when Rome came. Even when armies scattered the people across the Mediterranean, Jewish communities remained in Galilee, Jerusalem, and beyond, carrying memory and tradition from one century to the next. And here is the twist. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it accomplished something no other nation has ever achieved. That revelation is waiting at the end of this episode. Before we start, take a moment to subscribe. It's the simplest way to join our explorations of the past and to keep uncovering the stories written into stone, scrolls, and memory. This is Armchair Archaeology. Let's uncover Israel before 1948.
When most people picture the ancient world of the Bible, they imagine stories passed down through scripture. But the land itself preserves evidence that these kingdoms were not only stories, but political realities. By the 10th century BCE, two related states took shape in the highlands of Canaan, the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south. They were not just tribal bands. Archaeology points to organized societies with fortified cities, monumental buildings, and royal courts. Farmers terraced the hillsides, scribes kept records, and pilgrims traveled to sanctuaries that gave the kingdoms spiritual authority. Still, skeptics long argued that figures like King David and Solomon belonged more to legend than to history. Then the stones started talking. For centuries, there was no physical evidence outside the Bible that even mentioned them. Many scholars concluded that David was a literary creation rather than a historical ruler, a symbol of identity rather than a real king. Then archaeologists uncovered a broken basalt stone at Tel Dan in northern Israel. Inscribed by an Aramean king in the 9th century BCE, the stele celebrates victories over Israel and Judah. And in its lines appears a phrase that changed the debate: the House of David. This was not a myth or a memory invented centuries later, but a dynasty important enough for Israel's enemies to record in stone. Around the same time across the Jordan River, the Mesha stele was discovered. Written by the king of Moab, it boasts of victories over Israel, confirming the kingdom's presence on the map of the ancient Near East. Together, these finds anchor the biblical account in wider history. Just as modern nations assert themselves with treaties, flags, or press releases, Israel and Judah marked their place in the politics of the ancient Levant. And since we're talking about history written in stone, here's something a bit lighter. We designed an ancient secrets mug for the channel, a quiet nod to the mysteries we keep uncovering. It's become a favorite companion for research sessions and late-night note-taking. You can find it in our store if you'd like to share in the ritual.
Judah outlasted the northern kingdom of Israel, but in 586 BCE, its walls finally gave way before the Babylonians. The siege dragged on for months, hunger gnawed at the city, and desperation broke its defenders. When the breach came, Jerusalem was consumed by fire. The royal palace collapsed into ash, neighborhoods were flattened, and the first temple, the holiest place in Jewish life, was torn apart stone by stone. Survivors were shackled and marched east to Babylon. To them, it must have seemed as if their covenant, their nation, and their God had all been silenced. But exile did not erase them. In Babylon, Jewish communities learned to live in a foreign land. They worked in markets, heard new languages, and faced pressure to assimilate. Yet their traditions deepened instead of vanishing. Pilgrimage was no longer possible, so prayer took its place. Sacrifice gave way to study. Stories were written down, laws refined, and texts that would become the Hebrew Bible began to take shape. Out of dislocation came resilience and creativity, much like modern diasporas that carry culture across continents. Then Babylon itself fell to Persia, and a new ruler, Cyrus the Great, issued decrees that allowed displaced peoples to return to their ancestral lands and rebuild their temples. In Babylon, archaeologists uncovered this policy on a clay cylinder. Though Jerusalem is not mentioned, its words match the memory preserved in the Book of Ezra. It reads as an imperial proclamation, not as legend. For the exiles, this was a turning point. They came back to ruins, where burned stones and broken walls still scarred the landscape. Rebuilding was slow and contested, but in time, the Second Temple rose on the same hill where the first had stood. So exile was not an ending. It became a cycle of destruction and return, a model of survival that echoed through Jewish history.
The return from Babylon was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a new chapter. By the late 6th century BCE, the exiles and their descendants rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Though smaller than Solomon's original, it became the beating heart of Jewish life. Pilgrims streamed in from surrounding towns, festivals filled the courtyards, and prayers, once silenced in exile, rose again on the Hill of Zion. Over the following centuries, the land fell under empire after empire, Persian, Greek, and finally Roman. Each power imposed taxes and control, but none erased Jerusalem's centrality. For Jews, the Second Temple was more than a building. It was proof that faith and identity could survive conquest. Much like modern communities that preserve culture under occupation or exile, this sanctuary stood as a statement of resilience. The period also produced a flourishing of ideas. Scholars and priests debated law, prophets and poets added to the biblical tradition, and sects like the Pharisees and Sadducees emerged with competing visions. In desert caves near Qumran, a group carefully copied scrolls that preserved scripture, hymns, and commentaries. Nearly 2,000 years later, Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon these texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library hidden during turmoil and rediscovered in our own time. Roman rule brought both opportunity and tension. Roads and aqueducts connected cities, yet resentment smoldered. Resistance movements gathered strength, convinced that foreign domination could not last forever. The Second Temple, restored and expanded by King Herod, gleamed as one of the marvels of the ancient world, but its grandeur masked growing unrest. This was an age of devotion and division, of learning and longing. The Second Temple bound the community together, even as the pressures of empire pushed it toward the conflicts that would one day consume it again.
By the 1st century CE, tension between Jewish communities and Roman rule had reached a breaking point. Heavy taxation, corruption, and disregard for local traditions fueled unrest. The spark came in 66 CE, when protests in Jerusalem ignited into full revolt. For a brief moment, Jewish rebels seized control of their city and dreamed of independence. Rome answered with overwhelming force. Legions advanced through Galilee and Judea, crushing resistance town by town. In 70 CE, Jerusalem itself fell. The temple, rebuilt after exile and expanded by Herod, was consumed in flames. Its stones were pried apart until little remained but a single retaining wall, known today as the Western Wall. For Jews, the loss was devastating. Faith survived, but the central sanctuary was gone. Yet the struggle did not end. In 132 CE, a charismatic leader named Simon Bar Kokhba rallied supporters for another revolt. His forces struck Roman garrisons and briefly reclaimed territory. Archaeologists have found coins from this uprising stamped with phrases like, "For the freedom of Jerusalem," a striking echo of modern states that mint currency to assert sovereignty. Rome responded with brutality. Entire villages were destroyed, fields ravaged, and survivors enslaved. The revolt ended in tragedy, but the memory endured. One site in particular became legendary, Masada. Rebels and their families held this desert fortress for years after Jerusalem's fall. When the Romans finally scaled its walls, they found silence. According to tradition, the defenders had chosen death over surrender. Centuries later, Masada became a symbol of courage and resistance, invoked in modern Israel as proof that memory can be as powerful as victory. Moments like this show just how deep history can reach.
If you'd like to help us keep bringing these stories to life, you can use the Super Thanks button. It's a small gesture, but it makes a real difference in sustaining the channel. The Jewish revolts ended in ruin, but they ensured that the story of defiance, even in defeat, would never be forgotten.
After the Roman wars, it could look as if Jewish history in the land had ended. Cities were ruined, the temple was gone, and many people were scattered across the empire. But communities did not disappear. Life continued in Galilee, along the coast, and in pockets of Jerusalem whenever conditions allowed. Farmers still terraced hillsides, traders kept markets alive, and families gathered for prayer that no longer required a temple. In the Galilee, towns such as Tiberias and Sepphoris became centers of learning. Sages taught law and preserved tradition, and their work eventually formed the Mishnah and later the Talmud of the land of Israel. Ritual baths have been found beside homes, and burial caves line the hills. Quiet evidence that everyday practice endured. Archaeology gives this continuity texture. Synagogues from late Roman and Byzantine centuries dot the countryside, their floors paved with mosaics that show menorahs, shofars, and Torah shrines. In several sites, artists even set a zodiac into the synagogue floor, surrounded by Hebrew inscriptions and scenes of biblical seasons. The image looks surprising at first, yet it reveals how communities blended the visual language of the wider Mediterranean with their own symbols. Tradition adjusted, but it did not break. It is the same way modern communities borrow styles from the cultures around them while keeping faith and identity intact. Travelers and officials notice these communities too. Christian pilgrims recorded Jewish neighborhoods, and tax registers mentioned Jewish households paying dues to distant rulers. The numbers were smaller than before, but presence remained steady. So the story after the revolts is not an empty land waiting for return. It is a thread of daily life that never snapped, a continuity of prayer, study, and work that kept Jerusalem and Galilee at the center of memory until new chapters opened. From late antiquity through the medieval centuries, the land of Israel passed through many hands. After Rome's transformation into the Byzantine Empire, Christianity reshaped Jerusalem. Churches were built over sites tied to the life of Jesus, and imperial laws often restricted Jewish worship near the Temple Mount. Yet even under these pressures, Jewish life persisted in villages across the Galilee and along the coast. Families farmed terraces, markets bustled with trade, and synagogues echoed with Hebrew prayers. In the 7th century, Arab Muslim armies swept through the region, bringing new rulers and a new faith. Jerusalem was revered in Islam as well, and the Dome of the Rock rose where the Jewish temple had once stood. For Jewish communities, the change was dramatic, but not erasure. Records showed Jewish pilgrims still visiting Jerusalem, while villages in Galilee and the Negev sustained Jewish populations for centuries under Muslim rule. Pilgrims described the sight of domes and markets layered over familiar streets. The Crusaders brought another upheaval in the 11th and 12th centuries. When Christian knights captured Jerusalem in 1099, contemporary chronicles describe massacres that devastated both Jewish and Muslim inhabitants. Yet even then, Jewish presence never vanished entirely. In the decades that followed, small groups of Jews returned, rebuilding neighborhoods in Jerusalem and Ashkelon whenever conditions allowed. By the time the Ottomans took control in the 16th century, the land had been ruled by empires from every corner of the Mediterranean world. Each wave of conquest left its mark in ruins, fortresses, and religious monuments. But through it all, Jewish travelers, pilgrims, and residents kept ties alive. The great medieval Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela, writing in the 12th century, recorded Jewish families in towns across the land.
His descriptions remind us that even when Jews were scattered across Europe and the Middle East, they never ceased to live, work, and worship in their ancestral homeland.
When the Ottomans conquered the land in 1517, they inherited a region already layered with churches, mosques, and fortresses from centuries of shifting empires. The land was divided into provinces. Taxes were collected and local governors held power. Life was often harsh, but Jewish communities remained, and in some towns they even flourished. Safed in the Galilee became the most remarkable of these centers. In the 16th century, it rose to prominence as a hub of mysticism and law. Rabbis, such as Isaac Luria and Joseph Caro, turned Safed into the beating heart of Kabbalah, producing teachings that reshaped Jewish spirituality. But it was not only philosophy that emerged. Mystics also composed poetry for the Sabbath, songs meant to welcome the day of rest. One of these hymns, the Chadodi, was written on a Galilean hillside in this period, and it is still sung in synagogues across the world every Friday evening. A song born under Ottoman rule became part of the weekly rhythm of Jewish life everywhere, binding modern worshippers to voices from 5 centuries ago. Which moment in this journey so far strikes you as the most surprising link between past and present? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspectives always add new layers to the discussion. Elsewhere, smaller communities lived in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Tiberias. Pilgrims' accounts describe poverty and heavy taxation, but also resilience. In later centuries, particularly the 18th and 19th, new waves of Jewish migrants from North Africa and Eastern Europe swelled these populations. Farmers planted vineyards and orchards in the Galilee, reconnecting daily life to the soil itself. Travelers consistently noted Jewish families present in the land. Some described ruined synagogues, others spoke of schools, markets, and prayers still carried on despite hardship. For Jews scattered across Europe and the Middle East, these settlements were proof that the connection to the land was not just memory, it was still lived reality. So in the early modern centuries, continuity endured. The land was never empty. It pulsed with voices, prayers, and songs that still echo today.
By the late 19th century, Jewish life in the land of Israel was small but unbroken. Communities in Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias lived under Ottoman rule, often poor and dependent on donations from abroad. Yet their presence kept alive a chain of continuity stretching back for centuries. Across the wider Jewish world, longing for return remained alive, repeated daily in prayers and echoed at every Passover meal, next year in Jerusalem. In Europe, nationalism was reshaping identities and anti-Semitism was intensifying. Pogroms in the Russian Empire convinced many Jews that life in exile could never be secure. Out of this climate grew modern Zionism, the conviction that Jews were a people entitled to their homeland. Beginning in the 1880s, the first large aliyot, or waves of migration, brought thousands from Eastern Europe and Yemen. Their arrival was not easy. Malaria swarmed in the coastal wetlands, rocky hills resisted the plow, and money was scarce. Yet they drained swamps, carved fields into stone-studded slopes, and planted orchards. Out of necessity, some banded together into collective farms called kibbutzim, where meals were eaten in common halls, tools were shared, and children played together in courtyards. The kibbutz was not only a way to survive, but also a bold experiment in imagining a new society. In these same years, another transformation quietly began. Eliezer ben Yehuda, a teacher newly arrived in Jerusalem, refused to let his family speak anything but Hebrew. His son grew up hearing no other tongue. Soon, schools, newspapers, and even street conversations followed suit. Within a generation, Hebrew had leapt from ancient scrolls into daily speech, the kind of cultural revival that modern movements around the world still point to as extraordinary. So Zionism was not only about working the land, it was about reviving a nation's voice, spoken once again in the place where it was first born.
After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. For Jews, the moment seemed filled with promise. In 1917, Britain had issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for a national home for the Jewish people. Many believed the dream of return was finally becoming reality. At first, Jewish migration grew steadily. Survivors of European pogroms, idealistic young pioneers, and later refugees from rising fascism in Europe arrived in the land. New cities, like Tel Aviv, sprouted from sand dunes, while farming villages expanded across the countryside. The sound of Hebrew filled schools, markets, and even courtrooms, turning a once ancient tongue into the framework of modern life. But the promise carried tension. Arab communities, who had lived in the land for generations, saw Jewish immigration as a threat. Protests and riots broke out in the 1920s and 1930s, sometimes exploding into brutal violence. Britain, caught between conflicting promises to Jews and Arabs, struggled to govern. White papers issued in the 1930s restricted Jewish immigration, a decision that would later trap countless Jews in Europe as Nazi persecution intensified. Still, Jewish institutions grew. The Jewish Agency coordinated migration and settlement. The Haganah, a defense force, trained quietly under British oversight. Universities, theaters, and newspapers flourished, giving the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, the infrastructure of a future state. And here is the striking contrast. In 1936, Tel Aviv opened its first international airport and hosted the Levant Fair, a vast exhibition of technology and trade. Pavilions displayed electricity, textiles, and machinery, while banners in Hebrew greeted visitors. Just decades earlier, this had been malaria swamps and struggling villages. Now it was a modern showcase, a nation in waiting. The mandate period was not the fulfillment of the dream, but it set the stage. Out of conflict and creativity, a nation was preparing to be born.
By the 1940s, Palestine was strained to the breaking point. Years of immigration had built Hebrew schools, farms, and workshops, yet clashes with the Arab population grew more frequent and deadly. Britain, drained by the Second World War and unable to keep order, announced it would end its mandate and hand a question to the United Nations. Across Europe, survivors waited behind barbed wire in displaced persons camps. Families slept in wooden barracks, ration cards in their pockets, hoping for visas that never came. Ships crowded with refugees tried to reach the coast and were forced back by British patrols. For them, a homeland meant not a symbol, but survival itself. In 1947, the United Nations voted on partition. The plan proposed a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an internationally administered Jerusalem. After fierce lobbying, the resolution passed by a narrow margin. Jewish neighborhoods erupted in dancing and singing, even as leaders studied the map with mixed feelings. Arab leaders rejected the plan outright. Fighting began almost immediately. Roads were ambushed, convoys moved with armed escorts, and cities prepared for siege. As Britain prepared to withdraw, the Jewish leadership acted. On May 14, 1948, in a crowded hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence. Portraits hung on the wall, typewriters clattered in the background, and outside, people huddled by radios, aware invasion was imminent. Within minutes, telegrams arrived. The United States recognized the new state. The Soviet Union did too. Rivals on nearly every issue, they reached the same conclusion. For a country only hours old, that recognition meant instant legitimacy and a fragile shield of deterrence. The declaration did not bring peace. Armies crossed the borders within days. But the name of Israel returned to the map, carried now not just in memory or prayer, but in law, flag, and citizenship. Maps can change in a day. Stories take centuries. When people say Israel began in 1948, they are both right and wrong. The declaration in Tel Aviv created the modern state, but the name Israel carried centuries of history before that moment. Archaeology, texts, and tradition reveal kingdoms and exiles, temples and revolts, communities that endured under foreign empires, and migrations that never ceased. Here is the remarkable fact. 1948 was not the invention of a country, but the only time in modern history that an ancient nation was re-established under its original name, in its ancestral land, speaking its ancestral language, and practicing its ancestral religion. No other people has accomplished this. The rebirth of Israel was not only political, it was historical continuity brought back to life, like a thread stretched across 3,000 years, finally tied back into place. That continuity is why the story matters. It shows that identity can survive conquest, exile, and dispersion, carried in memory, law, and faith, until it finds its way home again. What was once written in stone and sung in prayer became lived reality once more. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Did you know that Hebrew was already spoken again in schools and markets before independence? Or that coins from the Bar Kokhba revolt were stamped for the freedom of Jerusalem? Which moment in this long journey surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds to the conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a new story from Armchair Archaeology. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, history is never just in the past. It shapes the names, languages, and nations we live with today.